Stephen, thank you for joining us on the programme. Your great uncle Cole was actually he was a genuine war hero.
Yes, but he would never have seen himself that way. I think one of the striking things about researching this very intense episode in our history is that those sorts of acts of heroism were almost commonplace. Not to detract from what actually happened, but so many people in the line of duty risked all, and of course nearly half of them were killed. So in those days what happened was you did a tour of 30 operations against the enemy, then you were arrested for a while, and then generally speaking you were required to go and do another 20 before you were regarded as having done your bit. The odds of being killed were very high, and in fact they said that if you made it past your first 10 ops you were probably more than halfway there. So many people just went in their first few ops because of inexperience and the difficulty of the job.
So he was relatively old, wasn't he? He was in his 30s, and of course a lot of aircrew would have been in their early 20s.
Yes, he signed up at the age of 35. Most of the crew he was flying with were in their early 20s. They were as young as 18. He obviously had a very strong sense of patriotism. He was devoted to his mother. His mother's marriage had split up and the children had stayed with her, which was unusual in those days. And so there's a great feeling of devotion comes through in his letters to her, and a great concern for her welfare. Oh, and I also came through this feeling I knew him better than, for example, the German pilot who I spent nearly 2 years interviewing.
Which is what's interesting is Otto Fries, who was a Luftwaffe pilot at the same time, and that's what makes, I think, the book so interesting, is that you've managed to actually get what it was like from both sides. And you always tend to think of, you know, plucky old Britain and how good the British were, and the Germans are all uniformly bad. But of course it's so much more complex than that. And Otto, again, he's a nice man.
Yes, he is. He's got this wonderful sing-song voice. You know, he's the sort of voice you'd put to you know, Pat the Postman or something like that. And he's a lovely, gentle, very intelligent man, and quite chivalrous. I mean, one of the things that was very interesting about all this is that he bore no hate towards the RAF bomber crews, and they used to refer to them as you know, the chaps from the other field station sort of thing. It was almost like you know, extension of Biggles.
Yes.
And there are many instances, in fact, of when pilots, or airmen, both RAF and American, were shot down, that the Luftwaffe rescued them from lynch mobs and the Gestapo. You know, they did have this very strong sense of chivalry.
I was telling you outside, my father's brother was killed in a raid over Dieppe, and I'm not sure, knowing that the effect that had on my family, I'm not sure how I would react talking to someone who may have been the man who pressed the trigger that killed my uncle. Yes,
here we have someone who has committed an act that has had a lasting effect on your family, has left a big hole in your family. And I'm not surprised at anyone who is not able to forgive and close that gap. On the other hand, I think we need to turn around the effect that the bombing campaign had on your average German civilian. One of the most, I suppose, moving experiences I had when looking into the German side of the story was when I went to a cemetery in a suburb in Hamburg, and I'd known, of course, that my great uncle had taken part in the first raid of what was known as the Gomorrah Operation Gomorrah, which set out to level Hamburg. And on the second night of that, which he didn't fly on, they did set fire to a huge part of suburban Hamburg, and there were about 40,000 people killed in that firestorm. And so I went to the cemetery and saw this huge mass grave of just the 37,000 people whose remains they couldn't identify. And that was quite harrowing, particularly since just across the road in this huge cemetery was the Commonwealth Cemetery, where all the RAF flyers who were shot down during that raid were buried.
I think that's what comes across in the book is that strange tension, because I mean what comes across in the end is actually the sheer tragedy of it all, because here are the finest of a generation from both sides, and they're killing each other.
Yes, I think that leaves me with a very heavy heart. I think you can be kind of a bit bamboozled by all the statistics, and what I've tried to do in the book is look at how particular individuals or particular places were affected by the war, because it brings it down to the level that you and I can understand, which is that could have been me, or that could have been my grandmother, or something like that. And I think that one thing that has really sort of brought this into focus for me was a series of emails I received from Otto Fries's daughter. Otto Fries, of course, had survived the war and had 2 children, and his daughter, who was born in the 50s, started writing to me after the book was published to say just how upset and regretful she was that her father had still not taken the opportunity to express remorse for the people he killed, and the military campaign of which he was an elite member. And she said simply, it was my generation that bore that stain for Germany. We were the ones who had to really front up to the world and say we were sorry. And it's all very well for him to say I was just fighting a defensive war and I was just following orders, but really, this stain spreads much further into the future.
That's a fascinating book, and actually a really valuable book, I think, as well. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.